ITV News with James Mates.
Good evening. Doctors' leaders sounded the alarm tonight over the shortage of PPE in some hospitals. The British Medical Association told ITV News that gowns and the most protective face masks are of serious concern to them. Making things worse, a flight carrying tons of the protective gear will not arrive today as intended. The government was questioned about safety equipment at its daily news conference. More on that in a moment. But first, this report from Neil Connery.
For those on the front line treating and caring for those with COVID-19, the issue of personal protective equipment remains centre stage. Despite all the promises of ramping up provision, reports of shortages continue. One doctor took her concerns to the gates of Downing Street today as professional bodies and unions' warnings over PPE mount up.
We're still in a position where we're on our knees begging for PPE. The government should have been prepared a long time ago, and that's why we're in this position now.
Over the weekend, a charter flight carrying 10 million face masks and other equipment ordered by the Scottish Government arrived at Glasgow Prestwick Airport. Meanwhile, a separate delivery of 84 tonnes of PPE, including 400,000 surgical gowns from Turkey, due today, has been delayed. The British Medical Association says serious problems remain.
Overall, there are still quite significant shortages. We've got something like a third of doctors finding themselves unable to reliably get hold of the FFP3, the tight-fitting face masks that people need to use in the high-risk areas. And gowns have actually gone backwards in terms of availability. We've got more people now saying they can't find a reliable source of gowns compared to 10 days ago.
With the Royal College of Surgeons advising members not to risk their health by working without adequate PPE, the chief executive of the NHS Confederation, which speaks on behalf of the whole NHS, says he would support those making such a decision.
If I was a doctor or nurse on the front line and I felt the PPE wasn't there for me to do my job, would the NHS back me in that decision?
I believe that NHS employers throughout the country would support any individual who was in a position where they felt they did not have the right PPE. Of course, we would expect individuals who are trained and have the official right PPE to go in. And virtually every member of staff is doing that every day, all the time.
But the fears of health and care workers over protecting themselves from COVID-19 remain. Neil Connery, ITV News.
The government was today again forced to defend its handling of the lack of PPE and its handling of the COVID-19 crisis overall. The Education Secretary, Gavin Williamson, dismissed reports, though, that the lockdown could be lifted within weeks, with schools being the first to open up. Here's our political correspondent, Daniel Hewitt.
As life in lockdown enters a fifth week, any signal of when it will be lifted was swiftly silenced today. Suggestions a date has been set for schools in England to reopen by mid-May, rejected by the Education Secretary, as he insisted the message that mattered remained the one he was standing in front of.
People are anxious to know when we're going to relax restrictions, when schools are likely to be fully back and open again. But I can't give you a date.
But for a second day, the daily briefing was dominated by concerns from the front line over access to personal protective equipment. What's taking place between now and this time next week or next Friday to ensure that NHS trusts aren't going into yet another weekend facing the prospect of running out of certain items of PPE?
I think we all recognise the enormous strain that's been placed on the whole system. And we also recognise that right across the globe, people are actually trying to get the same items of PPE from quite a limited number of suppliers. But we do recognise that we need to be working constantly in order to be able to boost supplies. We don't want to see anyone in a setting that doesn't have the equipment that they need to do their job.
Questions too from Labour today over whether the government failed to stock up earlier on supplies.
The government have said they'll give the NHS whatever it needs, yet we've still got healthcare workers on the front line crying out for PPE. They're putting themselves at risk by going to work to care for us every day, and yet don't have that protective equipment. So we really need a proper action plan from government now to get that protective equipment to the front line.
The government denies it wasn't prepared despite new guidelines asking NHS staff to reuse disposable equipment. Would you both personally be comfortable today working on a COVID ward having to reuse what's meant to be single-use PPE?
Some PPE is single-use. Some PPE that has previously been used in different diseases, in different settings, may be single-use. But we have very detailed guidance now about what PPE should be used in which settings. It is actually quite complex. We all need to use this PPE carefully.
Mr Williamson, meanwhile, said he hoped the delayed shipment of PPE from Turkey would arrive here tomorrow as the government prepares for more